Um, this is part of Tuesdays to Your Health monthly lecture series, and I'm delighted to be hosting this. I'm Dr. Brad Jacobs. For those of you that haven't been part of this monthly series, I welcome you, and we do this once a month, usually the second Tuesday of the month. This month, we're going to be speaking about nutrition, and there's a lot to talk about around nutrition. So I'm going to just give a moment or two for people to settle in and get started. Before I get started, as I give my talk, I welcome comments and questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A box sitting on the bottom of your screen there if you want to ask questions. The Bay Area is a wealth of information. I'm sure many of you have your own information and perspective. Some of you may be health professionals yourself. So I look forward to your input and contribution and to what we're speaking about today. So I intentionally chose the topic of grains, fats, meat, sugar, what's left on the plate, because it feels like, everyone has a comment for what necessarily is not healthy for you or what is healthy for you. And the science is somewhat lacking. There's a lot of personal anecdote. And I do think that each one of us has a different reaction and response to different foods and food groups and does better with certain sorts of diets than others. So, and I think each one of us has a different response. As many of you know, there's sort of a birthing around looking at our microbiome and looking how matching what is the flora in our intestinal tract and how might that match up against what we should be eating in our particular diet. It's an emerging science. Even though there's several companies out there touting that there's a lot of science, it's emerging, and I think it's all really exciting, but it's still pretty young. So it looks like we have about 60 or so people and more people coming in. And again, I welcome input as we come along here. Feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box, and I'll get to it throughout the chat, throughout the talk here. I'm going to have a series of slides we'll go through. It's a fair amount of slides. So some of them I'll whip through. This are more visual than anything else to give some color to what we want to talk about tonight. So let me go ahead and pull those up and see if we can get started here. Great. So again, my name's Brad Jacobs, and we run a practice called Blue Wave Medicine. For those that don't know of it, we have our offices based in Cavallo Point, which is in the process of reopening. As you know, the hotel and the restaurant and soon the spa. My offices are right next to the Healing Arts Center and Spa. And I also have offices in the downtown San Francisco area. My practice is an integrative medicine practice, which we'll speak to a little bit more, which really means that we entertain all disciplines and all worldviews on how we might think about health and healing and use sort of an evidence-informed approach towards that. I'm also involved in something called the Academy for Integrative Health and Medicine, and integrative medicine has really become its own subspecialty. And I'm board certified in integrative medicine. And that's really, again, focuses on a big piece of it is nutrition, as we see here tonight, but really self-care and lifestyle is foundational to really health, whether you have a disease or you're trying to prevent getting a disease or you want to improve the quality of your life. Self-care lifestyle is a huge proponent, and a big fundamental core piece is what we put in our mouths, our food, our nutrition. For most people sort of struggling with weight management, particularly in the setting of COVID, we're home more, our emotions are more sort of a lot raised right now, and there's a lot going on with respect to COVID, with respect to sort of the whole conversation around social justice and equality and inclusiveness and equity. So people tend to manage and cope through eating. So a lot of people are gaining weight, and a big component of that is the food and how much we're eating. So we'll speak to a little bit of that as we talk. throughout the conversation here. So without further ado, let me just sort of orient you a little bit to think about where's our biggest bang for our buck, and clearly upstream. And our biggest value as a healthcare system is really to how do we keep people healthy and really address people when they're at the lowest risk. Then as you move sort of up the scale of people getting more and more ill, of course, the costs go up and up. And 80% of the costs in the national healthcare system is focused on 20% of the population. And the reason is because things get really expensive as we get sicker and our quality of life goes down. So the hope and the intention of tonight is to really speak to how do we keep our quality of life up and maximize that. Whether you have cancer or heart disease or diabetes or you're overweight or you're healthy, any of that, across any of that spectrum, if we can improve our diet, we'll feel better. Or if we have a cleaner diet, our joints, for example, are less inflamed. Our sleep is often much better. We feel lighter on our feet. And so therefore the quality of life just goes up in every direction with respect to our weight management, with respect to the quality of the food that we're eating. And, as we see over time, as we've evolved, we've gone a little bit too far on the pendulum, where people are sort of supersized, both the food they're eating and therefore their own bodies. So how do we get ourselves back to sort of that optimal self? And for many people that say, look, it's too late. I'm 65 years old. It's water under the bridge. I can't change my habits. My body is my body at this point. My organs have advanced as far as they have. And actually, there's several studies now that have looked at folks that are 45 to 65 in that category. And they've shown that people that make a lifestyle change within 4 years can reduce their chances of heart attack and death by over a third. So, and which is pretty impressive. And they've compared that with folks that came into the study that already had a healthy lifestyle. And they were about the same at the end. So if you made lifestyle changes, even at age 64, 3-4 years later, you were doing just as good on average as those folks that have been doing it all along. Now you could argue, if I could just talk to God and gives me a direct line and tell me when my planned date of death is, I'll just go back 4 years and change my lifestyle then. That's one approach, but for those that have that direct line, please let me know, because I'd like one too. But the good news is that our liver, for example, regenerates. Much of our cells can regenerate. So it is never too late. And it's amazing to run experiments, which is what I recommend to all my patients. Run an experiment, do something different for a week and see if you notice a difference. And sometimes it takes a month, but somewhere in that range, you will definitely notice something if something is beneficial to you or harmful for that matter. A big piece of the equation and how the food we're consuming has changed over time is the biodiversity due to monoculture farming and the huge food industry and this really industrialization of our food chain, supply chain, has really changed the terrain and the soil from which we are able to get our nutrients. And, we are a reflection of the soil, and how we treat the earth does end up affecting our own health. And you can see that in lots of different research. I mean, this one particular study looked at the biodiversity and there's this hypothesis. It's correlational, of course, but the hypothesis is that, look, as we see a reduction in the biodiversity of the sort of the flora in the earth, we've then seen an increase in autoimmune and allergic conditions. So you can see here a reduction over time on the left graph, which is you can see here the living plant index going down, the LPI. And then on the right, you see asthma and allergic rhinitis going up over the same period of time. Similarly, you could look at other conditions, pediatric inflammatory bowel disease or celiac disease or type 1 diabetes and a range of cancers, particularly colon and rectal cancer, that are highly affected by the fiber content of our foods and what we choose to eat. So it's not, a cause and effect study. This is a correlational study, but it causes, some alarm for many of us. You'll see here that this, I love this wonderful principle here, the conference on the precautionary principle. When an activity raises threats to harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. Now, I know that their current political structure is not so in favor of science, but hopefully that'll change, and we'll see a different sort of relationship and appreciation of science in the next chain of command in the fall or the upcoming winter. So, and my sense of this is that science is really important, and what we do know is that we are really what we eat. I mean, there's no question that how we eat affects our body type, affects the quality of our life, and how important it is to really eat real food. Now, you'll notice on all these pictures here, not a single one of them has an ingredient list attached to it. If you walk into a produce aisle, there's no need for an ingredient list because you look at it and it is what you're looking at. Whereas you pick up a box of pancake mix, and clearly you have to read through what they decided to manufacture to make this food that we're calling food, which is really a manufactured substance that we're calling food. So what most people really that are in the field say is, look, if you can find foods that have an ingredient list that's shorter than 5 on that ingredient list, odds are it's a pretty healthy food. Now, there are exceptions. Ketchup, for example, tomatoes and sugar. There's almost as much sugar in ketchup as there is chocolate syrup. And there's other exceptions as well. But overall, if you can pronounce the ingredients, that is clearly a sign that it's usually a whole food. And if it's a short list. Now, this diet here is sort of the Harvard healthy eating pyramid that came out of the School of Public Health at Harvard. And in my mind, it's a bit dated, but it brings home the really strong messages. And they are the following. Number one, that daily exercise and weight control is core to healthy living. And then the other piece is that we need to limit the amount of white carbohydrates, that processed carbohydrates that we're eating, and that you'll see that on the top of the pyramid there. They also put red meat up there and butter to be used sparingly. My opinion about butter is that it can be used actually less sparingly. Margarine, for example, we know is very bad for you with trans fats in it, and that you're better off using oils, but also butter is a good thing and healthy for us. It may increase our cholesterol, but often increases the healthy part of the LDL. We call it the fluffier aspect of that low density lipoprotein, which is considered harmful, but it actually will increase the good substrate subcomponent within that LDL. There's a range of lipoproteins from small and dense ones to larger and fluffier ones within the low density lipoprotein profile. And often cheeses and butter will increase the larger, fluffier version of that LDL. So even if the numbers go up, it's important for a lot of people to look at that aspect and do a full profile of the LDL to see if it's mostly small and dense, which is more atherogenic and can cause heart attacks, or if it's actually more large and fluffy, in which case it seems to be neutral or possibly positive for us. So the rest of this pyramid really points out nuts and legumes are really important, fish and poultry and eggs as well. Vegetables in abundance, the more the vegetables, the better. Fruits, I don't recommend 2 to 3 times a day. I think you get too much sugar if you're eating a lot of fruit, but of course you can do berries and other fruits that are lower on the glycemic index. And whole grains. Now they put whole grains at most meals. I have a different opinion about that. I think that actually the fewer carbohydrates, the better. But some people that want to be vegan, for example, or vegetarian, will require more grains and legumes in place of the protein they get from animal product. And then plant oils, which I am in favor of. I think there's a big role for oils because you get sort of nutrient dense, healthy source of fat. The calcium, those recommendations have changed. You'll see that on the second rung in white, dairy or calcium supplement. dairy for certain, for those that can tolerate it well. But calcium supplementation, we used to recommend 1,200 to 1,500 milligrams of calcium a day, and often would recommend women supplement with calcium supplements. It turns out that we believe that over-supplementation of calcium leads to heart attacks, actually. So the current recommendations, particularly in coming out of the UK, are 800 milligrams a day, rather than the 1,200 to 1,500 milligrams a day that we had said previously. Now, what's interesting is the USDA diet and the Mediterranean diets versus the SAD diet. So at the bottom of this graph, you'll see the SAD diet. What is a SAD diet? It's the standard American diet. We consider the SAD diet, standard American diet, which is sad indeed. Even the USDA diet, which is, as you probably know, highly supports meat, highly supports milk, and highly supports corn products. And for obvious reasons, because the lobbyists have their hands lined in the pockets of all our congressmen. That diet actually is even 11% better in reduction of mortality than the current recommendations. So we like, corn, and we like sugar even more than USDA recommends. Now, if you do a diet that's actually a healthier diet, such as the Mediterranean diet, you'll see that you have a reduction of 23% of your death rate. And it's gigantic. So there's no medicine that can give you a 23% benefit and mortality benefit across the board than just changing your diet and having to a Mediterranean diet, which is what? It's mostly fish as your sources of protein, animal protein that is. It's lots of healthy oils, a use of nuts and lots of vegetables and some grains as well, but not a lot of the processed foods. So before we go into more details about different food types like carbohydrates and proteins and fats, we're going to talk about after this section, I want to talk about different ways of eating. So one way of eating that I'm sure many of you heard about is timed eating, meaning that some people call it fasting, overnight fasting. And what this really means is I'm going to eat between these hours. And typically it's an 8 to 10 hour window. And it might be, let's say, between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. And timed eating is quite interesting, and because when people that tend to do timed eating, they tend to eat less calories overall because they don't tend to snack at night. So a lot of us snack after dinner, right? We watch television and we sort of are bored, and so we tend to grab food, and then we might be in front of the television, and then in front of the television, then we don't even notice really what we're eating, and we're just sort of eating, and all of a sudden we're at the bottom of our popcorn or whatever we're eating. Timed eating really allows us to drop that, and it's ideal. The more the data is starting to look at, actually, even if you do timed eating, you're better off having a large breakfast, a large modest lunch, and a very light dinner. The old saying, sort of eat like a king, for breakfast, and like a prince for lunch, and like a pauper for dinner. So that tends to be better, so that as the evening comes, you actually have less calories in you, and that it actually does a better reboot during the fasting phase when you're done eating, which is primarily, call it 7 p.m. or so, till the next morning. And then your body moves into a fasting phase, and so it starts to use fat as its fuel source. And by using fat as a fuel source, it will actually literally burn the fat off your body, using it as a fuel source. So timed eating has been shown time and time again to be actually quite helpful. There's mixed data on should you skip breakfast or not. And more data, though, that's starting to show actually you're better off going light on the dinner and doing a heavier breakfast and lunch, and keeping that within sort of an 8 to 10 hour window. Episodic fasting is another approach to the same concept, which is maybe once a month you fast for a day or two. Of course, you need to make sure you have enough fluids in you, and you ideally don't do a heavy meal before the fast or at the beginning, at the end of your fast, right? After you break the fast, you want to sort of allow yourself to ease yourself back in. But that also does a great job on affecting it at the mitochondrial level and doing a reboot by putting yourself on what we call hormesis, which is sort of a light stressor on the body. It actually goes through and basically cleanses the body, in that it will, at a cellular level, identify cells or mitochondria that aren't functioning well, and render them out of the system. And by doing that, you then sort of repopulate your system with higher functioning, more efficient mitochondria, which are sort of the fuel source, the power source of every cell. And so there's sort of this cleansing process that happens in the body at the cellular level. Daily caloric restriction has been shown overall, if you look at all the blue zones in the world where people that live over 100 years, daily caloric restriction is really a big piece of it. People tend to be quite thin. They tend to sort of have this amount of calories that's just under what they need. Again, it leads to the same cellular processes when the body is put under subtle stress. So I'm a big fan of thinking about these different ways of approaching, optimization of your health. So if we think about sort of the different types of food groups, what we want to think about really is carbohydrates, proteins, and fat. Now, in particularly the Bay Area, and for sure in Europe and the United States overall, and particularly in the setting of COVID, alcohol has become sort of a fourth category of group of food. Alcohol consumption is up about 43% during this time in COVID. For lots of reasons, including emotional distress, boredom, and other reasons. So now, what's your contribution gram for gram of calories? Now, fat has the highest calories per gram, and which is why it's always got a bad rap. Well, you have 9 calories for every gram of fat that you eat, whereas for carbohydrates and protein, you only have 4, and alcohol is 7. But knowing that doesn't really tell you that it's bad for you. The reason it's actually a nutrient-dense food, which means actually it's quite good if you think about it over millennia and over the sort of the evolution of us as a species. Fat is something that you really want to go for because it's so nutrient-dense. Now, there's different ways to sort of think about how we're eating. So here's an example of a vegetarian diet, right? Here you have beans, a vegan diet, beans, rice, sauteed spinach, and broccoli. This is a meal that I prepared. Now, the downside of this meal is there's a lot of carbohydrate in this meal. The upside of this meal is, and by the way, it's lathered in olive oil. So there's olive oil enriched into sauteed spinach and garlic. There's also in the broccoli, and then we even put some in the beans. And the beans themselves are a good source for carbohydrate and protein, as well as fats. And then you have the rice, which is clearly just carbs. And then you have that sort of non-digestible fibrous carbohydrate from the vegetables. So for a vegetarian diet, this is quite healthy. It's a complete protein and it has a fair amount of fats in it, but it's carbohydrate heavy. Some people do well with this, and some people don't. The classic sort of version of what's recommended at the national level is something like this, where you say, okay, a quarter of your plate should be carbohydrate, a quarter should be protein with some fat in that, and then you have your vegetables. So let's spend a moment in talking about vegetables and why I sort of keep bringing up the term vegetables. And the reason is that the science has shown that every serving of vegetable that you eat, improves your health quality and reduces your risk of dying. That every vegetable across multiple categories. So they looked at it all-cause mortality, which is what this graph shows, but they also looked at it for colon cancer and lung cancer and heart disease and Parkinson's disease and autoimmune conditions. And I mean, at so many different levels, every serving that you eat, you get an improvement. On average, it's about 6 to 7% reduction in mortality for every serving. So if you have a kid or a friend or a spouse or yourself that you don't love vegetables, even if you move from 2 vegetable servings a day to 3, you're getting some benefit. It's not like you have to eat 5 servings of vegetables a day, which is what the sort of recommendations are. Of course, the more the better. Like you can see benefit even up to 7 servings of vegetables, actually. But you see there's a marginal benefit as you go up. So for that reason, I'm all about the vegetables. And I'm saying vegetables repeatedly, not saying fruit, because we tend to eat too much fruit, which has sugar in it. And people tend to, eat fruit juices or drink them, which clearly is just a gigantic bolus of sugar because it doesn't have the fiber that the whole fruit does. And so the fiber slows down. You have the same quantity of sugar, but it will be absorbed into the body much more slowly if it's bound into fiber. like an orange versus orange juice, for example. So, one fruit, serving a fruit a day, maybe two, if you're having, for example, berries, which is lower in the glucose content, then I think that's good. Now, how do you get enough vegetables? Particularly people that don't like vegetables. Here's some tricks, and I learned this thanks to my children. And because of my children, I've learned, like, how do you get vegetables into a kid who doesn't like the vegetables? The way I tend to eat in general for myself, and the reason I show this picture is because I'll make a big salad like this and then throw a piece of fish on top, or some chicken, or maybe it's just avocado and some nuts if it's just a vegetarian lunch, for example, or dinner. But that way you basically lay down a base of vegetables, pour some oils over it, some olive oil, balsamic vinaigrette, or some balsamic vinegar, whatever you want. Then lay down some, avocado. So now you've got a lot of fats. People often, particularly men, are quite hungry if all they have is a salad for lunch or dinner. But if you start laying down oils and avocado and nuts, all of a sudden, like I said, it's 9 calories per gram of fat. So all of a sudden you've got a lot of calories in your meal, and you'll find yourself much more satisfied. So one way to get a lot of vegetables, here's an example of a bag of baby spinach. And if the right bag, you can see how much was taken out of this bag, right? So 3/4 of the bag is now gone and placed into a saute pan. That makes only this much spinach. So if you want to get someone that doesn't like to eat vegetables to eat a fair amount, you can get that much, you can see here, which is probably 4 ounces of spinach, which is probably 2 to 3 servings of spinach. Really in 3 bites, you're done. So that's a great way, rather than eating a big salad, which requires much more time for people that are time sensitive and much more work, a lot more chewing. This is a really, and you throw olive oil in it, so they get, actually it's more nutrient dense because you're putting oils into it, and maybe garlic. And of course, grow your own vegetables. So this actually came from our garden, some blueberries, some tomatoes, pepper, some kale. And I highly encourage people to do that. It's amazing the difference in flavor you get when you're growing your own stuff. So, what should we be eating? This is one approach. You can have a deep fried cheesecake and a crunchy sweet tortilla, a dessert you can hold on to. So this is down on the boardwalk in Santa Cruz. So not only you can have a cheesecake, but you can deep fry it. And have this in this crunchy sweet tortilla. So there's lots of manufactured foods, and what we all really need to be aware of is literally they're manufactured. Literally, they're food chemists that are figuring out at the sort of neurologic level, how do we hit those parts of our brain that light up for pleasure and will want more? How do we light up our taste buds in a way that we're excited and we love the food? Dorito tortilla chips, Fritos, Frito-Lay, these, a Big Mac. The list goes on and on. The Twinkies, like, how do we design food so that it's so addictive? And literally, just like the tobacco industry has done that, so has the food industry. So don't be fooled to think that the food you're eating is food. It's actually manufactured food, unless, of course, you're in the produce aisle. So if you can, eat a range of colors when you eat your vegetables. And the reason is those colors represent different types of phytonutrients, and you will get different benefits from the different phytonutrients that you're eating. So again, I recommend a big range. So what kind of diets are there? There's a SAD diet at the bottom there, which is the standard American diet, which you can see here is 60% carbs. 2/3 carbs, and you can see how little fiber there is in that diet. There's only 15 grams. Whereas the other types of diets that are a bit more focused, for example, the Mediterranean diet, which really isn't a, quote, diet, it's just a way of eating out of the Mediterranean, right? Southern Italy and Greece, and you get that whole region there, and you'll find they're eating a little bit less carbs, a little bit more fat, and a lot more fiber, and very much less processed food. If you look at some more extreme diets, which are the ones in the top 3, you have the Dean Ornish's diet, which is historically a vegan diet, very high in carbohydrate, very low in protein and fat. they have a lot of fiber in their diet. And he has shown health benefits, cardiovascular health benefits, and modest to marginal prostate cancer benefits. He's currently doing a study looking at Alzheimer's as well. The ketogenic diet is one that's basically no carbohydrate, essentially. Those carbohydrates are coming primarily from vegetables. So they're really sort of considered a different category because they're so bound in fiber. It's quite a different category of food than rice, for example. And then mostly fat. So 70% fat. And then the protein is quite modest. Most people that are doing a ketogenic diet are actually eating too much protein, and they think they're eating keto, but they're really doing more of a paleo diet almost. And what happens in those situations is the protein actually does convert to glucose. When you're in a carbohydrate restricted diet, protein will then just convert over and become glucose. So the goal is to really reduce that protein amount in a high fiber. Now, people respond differently to these different diets, and my recommendation is to run your own experiments and see what feels better. What we do know is vegetarian diets really are much better when it comes to our health with respect to cancer risk, and when it comes to red meat, in particular, cardiovascular risk. Vegetarian diets. Now, the ketogenic folks will argue against that, but that is sort of, if you look at the data, hundreds and hundreds of studies over decades, that's pretty consistent. When it comes to the ketogenic diet, you can do it in a way that has low animal product, which most people do not do. But there is a, so almost a vegan approach or vegetarian approach towards ketogenic diet, where you're eating a lot of nuts, a lot of avocados, a lot of oils. And we can talk more about that if you guys have questions. So what are carbohydrates? If you think about it over time, none of these foods on this slide ever existed prior to the 1900s. So this is all manufactured food. A donut, chips, pizza, cereal, pancakes. These are ubiquitous now. And it's really, they're all the same thing. It's a refined grain carbohydrate with refined oil, with refined sugar. If you think about that, this makes up 70% of the Western diet, 70%. And these were virtually unknown in sort of, ancestral times. Now, what we do know about sugar is it's highly addictive. It's actually more addictive than cocaine. It hits a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which is really the pleasure center of the brain. And so when we have, and many of you have probably experienced this, I know personally, for example, when I experimented with ketogenic diet, and then I sort of allowed myself to go back and eat more carbohydrates, I was voraciously desiring the carbohydrate. It was shocking. It was an amazing experiment to run. So what we do know is it's highly addictive, and I invite you to run your own experiments to see. In the beginning, it's hard, and a lot of people feel uncomfortable when they're not all of a sudden stop eating carbohydrates and they're running an experiment for a ketogenic diet. They'll find themselves sort of challenged the first week or two. And then over time, all of a sudden, sort of like your palate changes, where if you cut out salt, all of a sudden, things that used to appear not salty enough, all of a sudden appear super salty because our palate changes. So does our chemistry and our neurochemistry. And all of a sudden, we don't have those cravings anymore. And we start to feel the benefits of a high fat, low carbohydrate diet. But everyone should run that experiment and see. Now, the quality carbohydrates to think about in grains, beans, and starches are ones that are whole. So even oatmeal, like you'll go into the stores and see like steel cut oatmeal cooks in 5 minutes. That is not a high quality food, even though it says steel cut. And the reason is it's been pre-processed so that it only cooks in 5 minutes. So the integrity of the fiber and the network that's there that will take a long time for you to be able to digest that food is gone. That's why it cooks in 5 minutes. And so when it goes into the body, for your body to absorb it, it'll happen in an instant because it's already been pre-digested for you. And another way to look at that is what we call the glycemic index. So things that are low glycemic indexed are things, for example, that slow cooking oatmeal, something that takes 30 minutes to cook. Whereas things that are actually higher are like, for example, baked potato or French fries or fruit juice. So that immediately gets absorbed into the body. So that's a term called glycemic index. It's the same amount of sugar that you're eating. The question is, how long does it take for it to get absorbed into your body? And the reason that's relevant is because when the sugar comes in, then the insulin has to respond. And if the insulin has to respond urgently and in massive quantities, because the sugar comes in so quickly, over time, it's like going to a loud concert repeatedly. And eventually, the noise is so loud that you start to lose your hearing. And so the same thing happens in our body that the noise gets so loud that the cells start to become resistant to the insulin then, because the insulin grabs the sugar, takes it to bring it into the cell to give you fuel. Without the insulin, you can't get the sugar, it just floats around, doesn't get into the cell without its buddy, the insulin, to kind of open the door and let the sugar into the cell. And so if it happens repeatedly, you get insulin resistance. And that's why type 2 diabetes is so high, including in the pediatric population now, which is the first time ever, starting in the 80s and 90s, is because we're eating these high glycemic index foods, we get insulin resistant. This is reversible. And so I encourage those that are insulin resistant or have diabetes to run that experiment. So things that influence our glycemic index are the quantity of food, the amount of protein and fat and fiber that's in the food. So if you're going to have oatmeal, put nuts in it, right? Why? Because it has fiber, it has the fiber content, it has fat in it, it has protein, and that will slow down the absorption of the carbohydrate into sugar. For example, how ripe is the banana that you're eating? How far do you cook that yam? Do you cook it till it's caramelized, that brown, beautiful caramelized, and it's like candy, which is so delicious? Or do you undercook it a little bit? So it's a little harder, not as delicious, but there's more fiber in it. Same with even the pasta, more al dente pasta than overcooked pasta. All these things relate to the fiber content, really. So what about protein? How do we get protein? What we know about red meat in particular is that a small amount of red meat, modest amount, is actually not so bad. There's a slight increased risk, but it's not dramatic. As you eat larger quantities of red meat, then you see the risk goes up. And that's what this is showing. Our hazard ratio, which is sort of the chances of dying, go up. You can see there if you're having 4 servings per day, or let's call it 3 servings per day of meat, the increase is about 1.6, so 60% increased risk of dying. But if you're down to less than 1, call it a half a serving of red meat per day, then you can see you're much closer to 1. So maybe it's a 10 or 15% increase in risk. They've run some other studies that look at if you replace meat with other things for your source of protein. So if you replace it with nuts, for example, you have a 20% reduction in your death rate, because nuts are a great source of protein and fat. And so they have health benefits in of themselves, and then you're replacing it. Same with, you can see legumes and all these others that we have here, even grains. So the thought here is that you're getting more fiber from the whole grain, and also that there's some deleterious effect from the red meat. So it's sort of a twofer. And you could see, again, that for fish as well. So another study really looked at 3.3% of deaths could be prevented if participants limited processed meat consumption. So this study looked at processed meat. So what does that mean? It means bacon, it means bologna, it means salamis. A lot of it relates to nitrates, but there may be other things we don't know that are even in nitrate-free processed meats. But what we do know for certain is that processed meats is harmful to us. And you can just see that's clear as day looking at this graph here. As the amount goes up, particularly in children, it can be quite harmful. So we eat way more protein than we actually need. Even if you're a competitive athlete, you really only need 0.6 to 0.8 grams per pound. So if you take a 150-pound person and they're athletic, they need 120 grams of protein, which is really about 480 calories, or would be roughly 24% of one's diet. So that's the current thinking on how much actual protein we need, which is actually less than we currently think. for most people, the way they eat. And there's lots of ways you can get this. So if you look here, from non-animal sources, so beans, tofu, peanut butters, you can see here that plant proteins aren't really concentrated sources of protein. So for example, you get a half a cup of beans or 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, you get 7 or 8 grams. Whereas if you have, for example, a cup of Greek yogurt, you get 23 grams of protein. And if you remember going back here, you're looking for an athletic person, 120 grams. So somewhere between 60 to 120 grams for a 150-pound person. So you can see how, thinking about from non-animal sources, how you might, it's important to think about how you find your sources of sufficient protein. So fats, we spent a fair amount of time talking about this already. Salmon is the one piece that I didn't talk about as a good source of fats, and fish in general. And the bad fats, of course, are pretty obvious, that you can see: chips, pizzas, and cakes and what have you. The one, when you're thinking about fat, that it's pretty much out of the marketplace at this point, is trans fats. And that's been clearly shown to be a problem, a dramatic problem. And then it's thought that saturated fats, which primarily from red meat, less so from butter and cheese, even though this graph shows otherwise, in most studies have been shown to be the primary issue. And then the monosaturated and polyunsaturated fats are really the ones that provide the health benefits, which is really what's going back to the diets. The Mediterranean diet is rich in these mono and polyunsaturated fats. So, where do we go from here? And overall, the most data right now is really looking at the Mediterranean diet. There's more research coming out around the ketogenic diet, which looks promising, looking at sort of surrogate markers. But there's a lot of data that's looked at the Mediterranean diet. And the EVOO, which is the extra virgin olive oil, you can see has been shown clearly to reduce cardiovascular events. So this trial was actually stopped early because the results were so good after 5 years. And what they really found here is that, a Mediterranean diet supplemented with extra virgin olive oil and really was, quite helpful, as was the Mediterranean diet supplemented with nuts. So that's really the take home. The control was, of course, just reduce your dietary fat. And that really did work for most people. So there are a couple take home messages around this. One is that a calorie isn't a calorie, even though Coca-Cola and other companies would tell you otherwise. That really the source of your calories, as we said in the very beginning, is really important to think about. Is it from a whole grain or is it from a processed grain? Is it pure sugar? Or is it coming from something that's bound in fiber and other things that make it much more slow to digest and much healthier for us? This sort of is a bit more detail, and you can see sort of the difference with the Mediterranean diet over time, looking at the extra virgin olive oil, and you can see for total mortality, as well as the top one looking at the primary endpoint of acute myocardial function, which is a heart attack, stroke, or death from cardiovascular causes. And you can see here that there was about a 30% reduction in your chance of dying if you follow the Mediterranean diet compared to the control group on that top graph. So what I put in bold here is the best diet incorporates high quality foods in appropriate proportions. And there isn't one perfect diet for everyone. And I really think people should experiment and see how they feel best. And, some people feel great, for example, doing the ketogenic diet. So let me spend a couple moments just talking about what that means. What we do know is people that eat a lot of carbohydrates tend to have increased risks of memory loss. So what we find here is that people have mild cognitive impairment, or MCI, when you look at lowest quartile versus highest quartile of carbohydrate consumption. And then looking at fat, the same thing. Those that have the highest amount of fat consumption tend to be at reduced risk of having memory loss. Now, these are, correlational studies. They're not, we didn't randomize people to 2 different groups and follow them for a decade. This was sort of asking people in large groups of people, how much fats do you eat, with specific examples, of course, or what is your dietary intake, and then they calculate their fat content and their carbohydrate content, and then they look at how they do in their sort of cognitive function scores, and they found these correlations. So there could be maybe people that eat fat in general tend to exercise more, and people that eat carbohydrates in general don't. And we know that exercise correlates with memory improvement, so maybe there could be what we call confounders. But for the most part, that's a really robust and interesting finding. So what we have looked at now is people started to do these studies looking at the ketogenic diet and looking at, for example, type 2 diabetes. So they took the group of folks with type 2 diabetes, and in this study, they found a body weight reduction of 15%. And what was really interesting about this study is their body weight reduction was sustained over a year. Usually people will go on a diet and then they'll actually rebound. And they'll gain weight again. And the problem with that is every time you lose weight, people tend to lose fat and muscle. And then when they gain weight back, they gain fat. And then when they lose weight again, they lose fat and muscle. And then when they gain weight, they gain fat. So at the end of multiple trials of losing weight, you end up with less muscle in your body and more fat. So even if you weigh the same, 250 pounds at age 50, 250 pounds at age 30, there's a good chance that you have less actual muscle mass in your body, and you have a higher fat content, which is actually obviously not in your favor from a health and quality of life perspective. So what's really exciting about this is people were able to sustain that weight loss. What we do know is that people feel better when they use ketones as a fuel source. As we get older, our memory isn't quite as good as it used to be, our response time, our cognitive thinking, our ability to parallel process, et cetera. And it looks like when cells are functioning at not optimal performance, as they're aging and mitochondria isn't functioning at optimal performance and efficiency, that ketones can become a preferred fuel source and much more efficient source for the body, and actually will then function much better using ketones over glucose. And so that's where there's a lot of interest looking at a ketogenic diet, where what happens in a ketogenic diet, and the reason it's called ketogenic, is because you're having so few carbohydrates and proteins as your fuel source that it forces your body to use fats, which converts to ketones as its fuel source. And so it'll literally grab fat from the internal organs and from the overall body fat that you're carrying and use that as its fuel source. As it runs out of glycogen and free glucose in the body, it then turns to fat to pull that as its fuel, converts it to ketones, and uses it as fuel. So people lose body fat, and they all of a sudden many people feel more clear-minded using ketones as a fuel source. There's different ways to check for if you're in, quote, ketosis or not. We think of diabetic ketogenic acidosis or diabetic ketoacidosis, which is life-altering and threatening for diabetics. That's at a much higher level. Of course, that's at like 80 and above on this urine keto stick that you check it on. This is much more mild at sort of the trace level. And so there's a lot of moderation or variability in the accuracy of these urine tests. So there's some other devices that out now people do finger sticks, and also there's a new breathalyzer test you can breathe into a machine that will give you results. So there's different ways to experiment for those that are interested. There's a range of cookbooks out there to make it easy for people, which is really important. Here's some examples. When I was doing a ketogenic diet pretty consistently, this would be an example of my breakfast. 3 eggs, sauteed the spinach that you've seen in previous slides, homegrown raspberries, a little bit of lemon, and with an avocado. So, example of a high fat rich diet with a modest amount of protein in it and really negligible carbohydrate. Here's another example of scrambled eggs with just a little bit of salami for the flavoring, mostly some kimchi and some fennel and sauteed spinach, again for a nice breakfast. There's actually cheese in those eggs as well for protein and fat source, primarily a good fat source here with vegetables and fiber. You can also make smoothies. Here's an example of using what we talked about earlier, plain whole fat. You know, if you have a flavored yogurt, guaranteed it's going to have a high amount of sugar in it. So you want a plain yogurt. This is a Greek yogurt, so it has more protein, but it's whole fat, as well as a ripple, which makes a great pea-based protein. That's very healthy for you. It has a fair amount of fat in it as well. Kefir, chia seeds, I thought some coconut oil, some cashew nuts, and so organics, phyto food that we have through Zymogen, and some green vibrance, which has a whole bunch of nutrients. And then you can see all the nutrient content here, and make that into a really nice smoothie for breakfast, for example. Here's an example of a lunch or a dinner where you, as I described before, you lay down a bed of salad, and then on top of it, you throw a little bit, you can see a little bit of rice, a little bit of some beans, some yellow beets there, and some salmon with a little bit of cheese as well on that salad, with a lot of olive oil and some balsamic vinegar. And since it's dinner time, people are probably getting hungry seeing this. Or here's an example of some, some barbecued halibut with some peppers and vegetables and shiitake mushrooms and yellow peppers and I think sauteed fennel as well. So these are examples of sort of you could see a low carbohydrate, but high fat, modest protein, a lot of vegetable diet. And so, we talked about different ways to achieve ketosis. You can do it through this ketogenic diet. You can try intermittent fasting, where you 2 days a week do light calories, or you could do a full fast, once a month, or you can do that timed eating, or what we call evening fasting that we talked about early on. So that's sort of the tour de force I wanted to give us. We have a few minutes left. And so if you have questions, please feel free to share those questions and go ahead and write them. So let me sort of look forward to answering a few questions here. So one question here is, please discuss the benefits and downsides of coconut oil. Is liquid coconut oil better? I don't know actually if liquid versus non-liquid is better. Typically, it's temperature dependent, and it's highly liquefies as it changes in temperature. Definitely extra virgin coconut oil is better than the other sources. There's been a range of sort of sources coming out for coconut oil, so it is important to get a high quality coconut oil. There has been some concern about the type of fat that comes from the saturated fat from coconut oil. Clearly, palm oil is a problem. I think coconut oil, I'm not convinced. There was a recent study citing concerns about coconut oil, but I'd like to wait for more evidence. So I'm currently still recommending people use that as a source of fat if they're looking for that. So there was two different people had that question about coconut oil. Let's see. I only eat fish protein, but I'm concerned about pollution of the oceans. So I think fish as a protein is actually an excellent source. There's a range of different ways to get your fish. And I think for the most part, there's a couple things to worry about. One is the fish you're eating endangered. The second one really just relates to sustainability of the fish and extinction of certain species. The second is mercury content. Is it, a big question. And then of course, PCBs and other sorts of pollutants in the ocean or from foreign fish. So in general, I recommend people go down on the scale, the mercury scale, which is really mean going down on the predatory scale. So larger fish, swordfish, swordfish and other large fish, tilefish, those ones have a lot, shark, of course, have much higher mercury content. So I do recommend people eat more on lower scale. Salmon in general has lower mercury. And there's a lot of other fish, halibut, et cetera, that are lower on the scale. And the EWG, the environmental, EWG, Environmental Wildlife Group, or someone will tell me what it is because I'm blanking right now. But EWG has a great resource for that, where they combine all three and to tell you which one on sustainability, on mercury and pollutants, which fish are the best to actually be eating. There is a company out there right now that's manufacturing fish, which is sort of an interesting concept. So they're actually, it's called, I think, Finless, and they're actually looking at making fish from petri dishes, believe it or not, and actually in the process of making that as we speak. So if they're successful, we'll certainly see that on the market and soon. Someone asked a question about spinach. For diners with a spinach aversion, consider more nutrients in spinach are made available with citrus is combined. Yeah, so particularly citrus is helpful for certain. Some options include orange, apple, tomato, lemon oil dressing. Also for those that are vegetarian and or anemic, or I should say not anemic, but have iron deficiency, you can have it with or without anemia. And many people, as a side note, are diagnosed or not properly diagnosed. They actually have iron deficiency, but you can have that without anemia, and people can have a lot of fatigue, and no one ever diagnoses them with it. Lemon or citrus in general, lemon and vitamin C are great ways to actually enhance the absorption of iron. So no matter if you're a vegetarian, you're trying to get sources of iron, using an iron skillet, using vitamin C tablets that you can eat, or actually using something like lemon. So thank you for that, that comment. What about raw fish? There's most people do fine with raw fish, meaning sashimi or sushi. I don't see any issues with it, assuming it's handled properly. And so another question. Let's see here. I've got a few more. Okay. How long on average does it take to see a change in cholesterol with lifestyle change to vegan? So in general, people will see a change within, I give it for certain 6 to 8 weeks, you can see a change in your cholesterol. Sometimes even sooner. But since it's a hassle to do the lab testing and it costs money, I recommend people take 2 months, typically 8 weeks to do that test. And can you address the natural change that comes with menopause? How can a woman in perimenopause or menopause fight the weight gain that comes with natural change? Yeah, so there is a shift for many reasons that where women end up gaining more weight during menopause. And, in part it's aging, but in part there is some shift for the hormonal changes that happen as estrogen and progesterone decline, and you get the oscillations in estrogen in the beginning, which lead to a lot of other changes as well, like hot flashes, et cetera, emotional changes. So in general, we recommend sort of increasing exercise, improving your sleep quality, which also can lead to weight change, because during perimenopause, there's a big shift in sleep quality, and that poor sleep quality in and of itself has been known to lead to weight change and weight gain. So I would focus on sleep as an important factor. And then I would increase the exercise as best you can. Again, women during menopause can have ligamental and joint issues, so it's important to be careful during that. But again, those are my suggestions. And really, I would try and eat a lot more vegetables, which again helps with estrogen metabolism, and also drinking more, just the standard things like drinking more fluid, particularly before a meal, to help fill you up, eating more fiber to help fill the body up so you eat less calories overall, but it is more of a challenge for certain. Thank you for that question. Can you please, let's see, what do you think about shrimp? So in general, I think shrimp is, for most people, they do quite well eating shrimp. I think it's a good source. We used to be concerned about cholesterol content related to shrimp, and we used to say that about eggs as well. But eating cholesterol doesn't mean they actually will increase your cholesterol in your bloodstream. It's the fat, saturated fat, that leads to that, and particularly around the animal-based saturated fats in particular. Does a lower recommendation for calcium of 800 milligrams apply to women with osteoporosis? It does. I think there's a harder, then you have to look at the risk benefit. So I do recommend that you say here, if someone who's lactose intolerant and can't eat dairy, so then I would supplement. And if you're having to sort of weigh the risk benefit of supplementing with calcium, and you don't want to take a bisphosphonate or these other medications to try and improve your osteoporosis, if it's truly osteoporosis, not osteopenia, meaning that it's actually beyond the cutoff and you actually have osteoporosis, then I would recommend increasing the calcium intake up towards 1,200 milligrams and seeing if you notice a difference. So someone loves bread. Don't we all love bread? And what do you suggest to make the switch to reduce my intake of bread food? So, and again, everyone's a little different. Most people do better just turning it off, like sort of a switch, on-off switch, rather than dialing it down, meaning that to go to half a slice of bread is hard for a lot of people when they usually have 2 slices. So the other option is you just don't stock the house with bread anymore, and you replace it with something that you like that happens to be healthy. So if you have bread if you make sandwiches for your bread, that's what you use it for, then switching to salads is actually a better alternative anyway for your lunch. Let's say if breakfast you like to have a slice of bread, I would at least move towards whole grain breads like the Messenmacher breads and these Messenmacher and these other German breads that are compressed and they're literally whole grains. You can see them, the grains cut, like literally whole grains, you see them. Is a great alternative. You know, at a minimum, move to whole grains, and then literally the ones that are literally, like if you have 100% whole wheat, but it's a squishy bread, it's 100% whole wheat, but you can tell it's pre-digested foods, right? Because it's so squishy. Whereas you take bread like Messenmacher, it doesn't really compress, and that's because it's really these whole grains, and it's much more fiber rich. So I'd recommend that you try something like that. Let me see if we're over. So I don't want to take too much of everyone's time, but there are more questions. So let me just try and get some of these. Thank you for that response. The Environmental Working Group, thank you for EWG. And I do recommend they're a great resource for a lot of different issues, including pesticides, for example, high pesticide, low pesticide fruits and vegetables, and which one to buy organic versus not. The Dirty Dozen, they call it, and the Clean 15. Meaning the Clean 15 foods that you don't have to buy organic for fruits and vegetables, and the Dirty Dozen, the ones you should buy organic because they're dirty with pesticides. Thanks for that. MCT oil. So a lot of people use these medium chain triglycerides, typically a C6 or C8 carbon chain, as a source for highly refined fat that really has no taste. If you eat too much of it, you get diarrhea, because it's just fat that just sort of goes through you. But there hasn't been studies per se looking at it for MCI, but in general, if you're thinking about that as a source for fat, I think it's a good one. I think it's a nice way to be able to increase the amount of fat you're trying to get into proportionally into your body. People throw it on salad, they throw it in a smoothie. It's basically relatively tasteless, or it is tasteless. So I think it would be a good choice. Thanks for that question. Are there good types of granola to eat? So in general, granola is ridden with a lot of sugar. So you got to find sources that are whole grain based, that have less of the grain and have more nuts and oils in them than they do on the sugar and on the grain part. So I try to look for granola, either make your own, or you look for granola that has a lot of healthy oils in them and more of the nuts in them, and then or the whole grain. Literally you'll see the whole grain in the granola. But I think that's great to mix in, for example, with a plain whole fat yogurt and a little bit of berries. It's like a great breakfast. It's sort of my standard go-to. And let's see if there's any others to just tap into here. I think we covered most of the things I wanted to bring up. So thank you for coming to this once monthly webinar that we give. I really appreciate your questions and your input that people have provided. I look forward to coming to doing this next month. If you are interested in not on the newsletter, feel free to sign up. You can go to Blue Wave Medicine, which is our practice, and you can sign up. If you're not on the newsletter, feel free to, and we'll send an announcement letting you know about the next webinar. I also have a YouTube channel where I give updates, usually about twice a month, roughly, on related to COVID. If you're interested in trying to get some real information so you don't have to pay so much attention to the crazy media, feel free to use that as a resource as well. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you another time. Bye-bye.